This is Maggie Gundersen, and I'm the president and founder of Fairewinds Associates, and I'm really happy to welcome you here today. Today, as a change of pace, we have a special guest, and that is Marco Kaltofen. He is an expert in radiation chemistry and monitoring, and he is a professor at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts. So he will give you a little bit about his background and introduce himself, but I just want to thank you, all of our viewers, for watching us so often and watching Arnie's videos. And we wanted to answer a lot of the questions that you've had. We've had hundreds of emails asking us about radiation. And as an expert witness and paralegal services firm, I'm a paralegal, and we have other experts who work with us in the firm. We wanted to bring you expert testimony from someone who knows more about radiation than we do. Arnie, as a nuclear engineer, knows what happens inside the reactor and how those actions create the issues that have happened at Fukushima and at other plants across the country. But now Marco will be able to talk to you about what happens when the radiation comes out and where it's going. Marco, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Actually, I'm working on a dissertation. I'm just an older grad student at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And what my research is in is nuclear fallout and tracking it over long distances. One of the things that's very interesting about the Fukushima radiation releases is that we often hear about general radiation levels, things people measure by sticking a Geiger counter out a car window, for instance. What I'm looking at are microscopic or even nanoscale particles that contain highly radioactive materials that are small enough that they can just blow with the wind and sometimes travel great distances. In our research, we've been able to track some of these particles hundreds of miles, even thousands of miles. And what happens is, unlike the radiation we're seeing in Japan, where someone can just move, drive away from a high radiation zone, these particles travel globally, and if they're inhaled, if someone breathes them in, you actually carry that with you in your body. It has a very different impact, and it's the kind of radiation where background doesn't mean as much. It's more a matter of how do we avoid eating or breathing in those radioactive particles.
That's really interesting material for us to hear, and that answers a lot of the questions that we've been getting. How is this different than, say, dental x-rays?
Well, the thing about a dental x-ray is it's a set amount of radiation. We can predict better what is going to happen to someone who has that kind of dose, that amount of radioactivity. With a particle, it's very different. A single particle can carry a pretty significant amount of radiation. And wherever it lands in your body, it can start to damage that tissue or kill cells. Cells that actually survive that kind of irradiation could potentially form a tumor. So we worry about how these particles travel, whether they're traveling through the air and we breathe them in, or whether they get absorbed into our food and water. We should behave differently if we want to avoid that kind of radiation. And the thing about a particle, of course, is it travels a long distance, but it doesn't change very much. And now we're beginning to see some of these radioactive particles appearing in air in the United States that look very much like the particles we find in Japan. Our early data is showing that particles that contain americium, europium, bismuth, uranium, and other radioactive materials are found in the air and in the soil in Japan, and we're starting to see particles like that appearing on the west coast of the US in some of our other air samples.
So, if I understand correctly what you've said, for example, radiation from cigarettes, that would be something internal?
Correct. There's a certain amount of natural radiation in a cigarette. We take it into our lungs, and I think by now we all know that that's just one of the many reasons we get lung cancer from smoking.
What about we hear all the time, well, the radiation you're receiving is just like an airplane trip or a chest x-ray in that sense. Like, what's the difference? Can you explain that to us?
Of course, these are short-term exposures that we're comparing the radiation to. A plane trip is a few hours. A dental x-ray takes a few moments. Your exposure is over. The trouble with particles is we can get these particles into our homes where they're going to constantly recycle and continue to expose people. That radiation exposure doesn't end after a few moments or a few hours. It can be continuous. And if we do absorb it in our bodies, and then we're going to get that dose potentially for the rest of our lives. So it's very important to distinguish radiation caused by these particles in dust and take extra measures to reduce that exposure.
So people leaving the contaminated zone, for example, are still going to be getting these particles, these little pieces that we can't see when they breathe.
What's happening is these particles tend to stick to the nearest surface. They can stick to our clothing, to our skin, to concrete, even to things like carpeting or plant material. So if we want to reduce the exposure, we have to either prevent those particles from landing in the first place, or clean them off, or get rid of the affected clothing, or even the affected soil that has to be removed. Anything to reduce that long-term exposure to the radioactive particles.
So your testing has found these little particles contaminated
When
in
we
just
I'm sorry.
In just Japan or all over?
We see some of the same things appearing in our samples in the United States. What we've done at Worcester Polytech is set up a half dozen air sampling stations. They're on the western U.S. coast, the east coast, Hawaii, and Japan. And we look at some of the radioactive materials we see in Japan, like radioactive iodine, radioactive cesium, or these particles that contain americium and similar materials. And we see the same signature in our samples from the United States. There are less of them, but they're still there, and they're clearly related to the Fukushima release.
Wow, that's serious. What can you tell us more? What does that mean for us if that fine dust is escaping from Fukushima all over the northern hemisphere? Is it all over the world?
I would think that we'd be seeing more of it in the northern hemisphere. Back in the 1960s, when we did atmospheric nuclear testing, we tended to see the radiation landing in about the same latitude where the bombs were detonated. So if you detonated it in the northern hemisphere, you tended to find it in the northern hemisphere. The United States and North America, of course, is at about the same latitude as Japan. So we would expect to find more of their releases here in the U.S. And just as a rule of thumb here, the kinds of levels that we're talking about in Japan, nationwide, are probably a good deal larger than even the peak levels of the atomic test period back in the 1950s and 60s.
So what we have now